Introduction. A brief introduction to those of you who are new to the MLRC. We are a research center focused on teaching and learning at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and our goal is to advance educational outcomes for multilingual learners through innovative and socially just research, and also research practice partnerships. As part of UW-Madison's School of Education, we're located within the Wisconsin Center for Education Research. And this speaker series highlights current research related to teaching and learning of multilingual learners. It's typically the first Thursday of the month, and we are honored to have a researcher or a team of researchers share insights, findings, or their learnings from their research. You may have seen Sarah just turned on the recording, and so recordings are posted within 1 week of the event. So we are thrilled to have Meg Montee join us today. Meg's the Director of Assessment and Evaluation Director of the Assessment and Evaluation Language Research Center and an Associate Professor in Linguistics at Georgetown. Her primary research interests are language testing and program evaluation. And she also researches language policy and leads projects to support and expand language education in the US. Anyone familiar with Meg's work knows that she brings a great deal of expertise in language assessment, test design, particularly in the areas of reading and writing. And she's a longtime collaborator with UW researchers, has worked with many of our WIDA friends through CAL, the Center for Applied Linguistics, and also works with schools to develop assessment tools and training materials for local context. We are really thrilled that you're joining us today, so welcome, Meg.
Okay, I think that's my cue then. I'm gonna share my screen and get started. Great to be here with you all, and thank you for that introduction, John. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Multilingualism for All, U.S. World Language Policies and Implications for Multilingual Learners. And I appreciate that John gave an intro because I did want to start by talking a little bit more about my own background. And kind of how that situates the work that I'm going to talk about today. So for about 16 years of my career, I worked at the Center for Applied Linguistics as a researcher and test developer, particularly on WIDA access for ELLs. So working in the space of multilingual learners, English language education in the US K-12 context in particular. And doing very practical work with educators, with testers, with schools, looking at the assessment system. Now, in the hat that I wear at Georgetown University, I direct a language resource center called the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center, or AELRC. And the work that I'm presenting today is coming out of the research of this center. And we are funded by a grant from the US Department of Education. And we do work to support and promote the teaching and learning of languages other than English. So while I started my career with this long and very solid foundation in English language education, I'm now focused on everything but English language education in the US K-12 system. And so this has helped me to think about how our language education policies across this divide of English language and world languages enacted, and what are the potential connections that we might leverage for stronger multilingualism in the US. And so that's kind of my background and how it connects to my thinking in the talk today. And as I get started, I want to say my goal for the presentation and what I'm thinking about in my own work across many different projects is this big question of how can US language education policy and practices support multilingual development for all students? So we're coming at this from the mindset of equity and access for all students. And I debated a lot on whether I should say world language education policy and practices, because that is the area I work on now. But I do want to be broader today, especially talking to this audience. And so at the end, we'll have time for questions, but I really also hope this is a conversation with you all about policy connections you see, as well as how we can address some barriers to robust language education. Because I think, and I'll talk about some research on this, but I have these two circles here. In my experience, English language policy is often very separate from the policies and practices around world language education. They are the laws governing those things are very different structures and totally separate, and often the educational practices sort of run in separate spheres from one another. Often, and I'm always encouraged when I see overlap, particularly in the area of dual language and heritage language education, where I think these worlds come together a little bit more. But I hope to see more of this overlap and more of this connection. Okay, so that's my big question for today. And so I won't be following a traditional research talk structure, but what I'm going to talk about is some background on the case for world language education. So why it matters and why we should be promoting the teaching and learning of languages other than English in the US, and what that means for multilingual learners. I'll talk about 3 studies in the realm of policy for world language education. And then at the end, discuss this connection between multilingual learners and world language policy. Okay, so that's the structure of my talk today. And as I get started, I want to say a thank you and acknowledge my collaborators, wonderful student researchers who have contributed significantly to this work at the AELRC, as well as acknowledge once again our funding from the US Department of Education that makes all of this research possible. So I'll start with the background, making a case for world language education. And I know some of you work in the area of world language education, but if you don't, this may seem a little bit funny to you. Why do you need to make a case for language education? But I'll come back to this point again and again. But in the US, English language education is guaranteed at the level of federal policy, right? Students who are identified as English or multilingual learners have a right to language services. And now that is enacted at the federal level by states who interpret that policy and apply it within their state. But there is nothing parallel for world language education. So it's entirely at the state level. There are funding structures federally, nationally, but not policies. And so world language education is distinct in that we're often advocating for its importance and making the case for why we need these classes and why we need language education. Okay, and so the starting point for that, I think, is the robust and well-established research on benefits of multilingualism. This comes, I'm going to synthesize briefly here, Fox and Webb research synthesis that looked at 100 empirical studies from 2012 to 2019 and found across the body of research from associated fields, this was published in Foreign Language Annals, we see cognitive abilities and benefits associated with multilingualism. For example, increased cognitive flexibility, benefits related to aging and health. For example, delaying the onset of dementia for those who are multilingual, employability in terms of increased career opportunities or financial compensation associated with language skills, academic achievement in content areas and language and literacy development, communicative and intercultural competence. Even we see multilingualism in early language learning affecting things like empathy, openness to other racial or ethnic groups. So we see benefits associated with that, as well as enhanced creativity for those who are multilingual. So these benefits are varied, they're robust, and they're well established by research. And I think I may be preaching to the choir in this case, but I think this is something that we need to work on communicating really clearly externally to those who are not language educators and who may not inherently value language education. But we see that it has tremendous benefits, potentially both to individuals as well as on a social level. And I just want to briefly make the point that there is also good research that tells us that earlier learning is better. So the earlier that students have access to language learning, we see clear benefits to things like phonological development during the sensitive period of second language acquisition. But we also know that we can see better outcomes, right? If students start learning language earlier, we'll be more likely to get to higher proficiency outcomes the earlier that we start. So multilingualism is beneficial and positive, and early multilingualism is what we want to promote. Okay, so that's one starting point for why we need world language education. We also know, this is well established, that the US needs L2 speakers and multilinguals. We have workforce needs. We have national security considerations around what is sometimes called critical languages or languages that are critical to national security, as well as considerations around being globally competitive as a nation. Multilingualism contributes to this. It contributes to our economy and the preparedness of our workforce. And some of this that I'm talking about is coming from a 2017 report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that talked comprehensively about America's languages and helped to make the case for this need or this national capacity pipeline issue around language proficiency and multilingualism. But that's the case. We have this need. But we know from data as of this report that about 65 million Americans, or about 20%, speak a language other than English at home. Okay, so 20% of our total population. So while we have this great need for multilingualism in our country, we see that it is currently fairly limited in terms of the percentage of the population that is multilingual. Okay. And I thought that in this report, they highlighted a really nice vision for what would be a feasible model of multilingualism in the US. What could this really look like if we were to think about it in terms of like a practical percentages? And so we can think about everyone, 100% of the population could have second language exposure and global awareness. Okay. A smaller set of the population, about 30%, could have practical, occupational, and personal language skills. 15% could have global professional practice, and then 5% at the level of expertise, right? Really high level multilingual language proficiency. Okay, so this is a vision of multilingualism in the US, but I think it's really nice when we talk about expanding multilingualism in language to think really concretely about what that might look like nationally. Okay, so how can this happen? How do we get there in terms of the programs, policies, and structures that are in place? That report puts forth many different dimensions and areas where we need to move forward in order to make that vision feasible. But one that I wanted to highlight for this talk is specific to heritage language education, because I think it speaks to the intersection of world language and multilingual learners. And so in this report, they strongly recommend supporting heritage languages that are already spoken in the US and help these languages persist from one generation to the next. And so we know that our multilingual learners have rich linguistic resources that we want to promote and preserve. And so we can do this through encouraging instruction in heritage languages, providing those opportunities, both in the K through 12 and at the college level, as well as ensuring that students have opportunities to get credit for their language proficiency. Okay. Okay, so we've established multilingualism is beneficial. We have a great need for multilingualism in the US and a limited population. But we also know unfortunately, that learning opportunities are limited for L2 development. So if we want to see more early language learning, the main place we would look to is in schools and through our education system. And I'm actually going to start with data from higher education because I'll show you what's available for K-12 in languages other than English, but the best data and some of the most recent data we have about language education in the US is actually coming from higher education. And I think I sometimes use the word enrollment crisis or crisis of world language education, and I think that is fair to say in the US right now. We have a really important report represented here from the Modern Language Association, where they conduct a national census periodically in order to look at enrollments in languages other than English in higher education, and also programs. And what we've seen is that since 2009, enrollments in basically all languages have been dropping. In the most recent report, which was with 2021 data, we see Korean has growing enrollments, but for all other languages studied in US higher education, we see that both programs and enrollments are on a downward trend. So what this means, that's shown in the figure here, it's the enrollment data from the beginning of when that study has been done through 2021. So you can see the decline here in more recent years. So this is very concerning to those of us who work in world language education. And this is also making the news as well. It's sort of getting outside to the general public. Very famously, in 2023, you may have seen in the news about West Virginia. So the flagship university in West Virginia, University of West Virginia, cut its foreign language programs, its world language programs. And so that, again, was very surprising, shocking, and concerning. So this is what's happening in higher education. Of course, my focus today is on K-12, but we do know that we see similar concerns there, although we don't have as good recent data. One thing we do have and know from K-12 comes from the National Center for Educational Statistics. So they conduct what's called a school pulse panel, which is a nationally representative survey. And so we had data just come out in 2024, nationally representative data about the percentage of public schools in the US, K-12, that are teaching languages other than English. And so we see in January 2024, 43% of all public schools have some kind of world language program. And that's 20% at elementary, 61% at middle or combined, and 82% at high school or secondary level. So we see, although early language learning, as I said, is so important, it's really quite limited at the elementary school level in terms of the opportunities that students have to study a language other than English. So what I want to talk about next is, what does this have to do with multilingual learners or English learners? Why does this matter for that population? And I want to say, I think this is a nice time to acknowledge what I see as a really positive development in the language that we use. So I clipped a screenshot here from EdWeek talking about the debate over English learner terminology. And many of you have probably seen this evolution in the field from limited English proficient students to English language learner to multilingual learner. And I want to say, I think this terminology reflects an assets-based mindset, of course, which is wonderful to see, recognizing that students aren't deficient in English, and we don't want to frame them in that way. But in fact, they come with important linguistic abilities, resources, knowledge that we want to frame them as multilinguals, as bilingual students from the very beginning, rather than a deficit around the English side of things. But I think the label multilingual learner is helpful and thinking more comprehensively about our language education system in the US as well, because it puts these multilingual resources that students bring to the forefront for us. And I hope helps us think about the linguistic repertoires that they're bringing into schools and classrooms and programs. And this perspective of sort of connecting world language education and English language education is nothing new. I pulled from Donna Christian, the former president of the Center for Applied Linguistics, writing about this in the Modern Language Journal all the way back in 2007. And I'm just going to read this quote because I think she identifies the connections here really nicely. And Christian says, in the US, two significant problems converge that could be addressed with improved policies and practices in language education. First, the US lacks the language resources in languages other than English to meet its various goals. And this is true across the board. It's particularly troublesome that individuals with high levels of proficiency in certain domains of languages cannot be found when proficiency is called for. Okay, so that's the first problem, is we don't have enough multilingual individuals, particularly at high levels. And then she goes on to say, second, students who enter our schools with native-like proficiency in languages other than English, their heritage language, often suffer academically because they receive instruction only in English. Research shows that these students could benefit from continued development in their native language, both academically and cognitively, because they could develop high levels of proficiency in their native language while mastering English. They represent a lost resource. Okay, so here I think this really nicely sort of identifies that not only do we have students with multilingual resources, but there are actually academic advantages to supporting them in learning and using languages other than English in school. And so this is beneficial for the students as well, to promote robust language education for them. Okay, so this has been established. And one thing that Christian identifies that I want to build on a little bit is that when we talk about national capacity for language, we're often thinking about the pipeline. How do we get students? How do we get a large number of students who know languages other than English? What should that look like? But for individual students, we're often thinking about pathways. So how do they route through our education system? And where are they learning languages? How is that happening? Or where are they sort of branching off and making other choices? And so we're losing those opportunities. And so when I think about world language learning, I start here with a student. I think we often envision that student as a monolingual English speaker who is starting to learn a language other than English. But I think it's worth reframing that and really thinking about this learner, this student depicted here in a different way. Because I think if we think about all students, that includes multilingual learners, heritage speakers of other languages, and it helps us envision the pathways that they might take and the barriers that they might face in a more robust way. So we think about our learner. They are typically going to go into K-12, and our multilingual learners may be entering school at different times if they're immigrating to the US. So we think about the pathways that they have for accessing language education in the K-12 context. Okay. Then that student is going to graduate, potentially also receive the seal of biliteracy, which I'll talk about as a credential in the US that recognizes language proficiency and ability. And then that student will go on to higher education and or workplace and career with potentially additional opportunities to study language or to use their language abilities and their multilingual repertoire. And so in the work of the AELRC, we're trying to look systematically at where opportunities and barriers might exist to improve world language education along the pathways that students have, but really working to envision that student, who is this learner, in a more broad way so that we can ensure that there are equitable opportunities throughout a student's academic career. Okay, so with that, I'm going to transition for the remainder of my talk to highlight 3 studies that are coming out of the AELRC, the Assessment and Evaluation Language Resource Center. And so these all have to do with areas of world language policy, primarily, as well as practice. And I'll briefly review the results of those studies and to highlight implications for English or multilingual learners within each of those studies. And so what I want to start with is a study of state policy. So what are the policies for world language education? And as I said, these are our research questions for that study. But as I said, in the US, English language policy is established foundationally at a national level, and then each state, of course, interprets that. But there is no corresponding requirement or policy at a national level for world language education. And so what this means is that if you want to understand what's happening at the K through 12 in the K through 12 context, you do have to look within the states. Each state has their own policies and requirements or lack thereof. And so in this study, we are conducting a current national study of all 50 states and the District of Columbia to look at, number one, what are state laws and statutes that explicitly provide for or require world language education? Are dual language programs established through any state laws or statutes? Number 3, are there any high school bridge programs? Those would be high school to college bridge programs. And number 4, do the state's public colleges and universities require world language study for admissions? Okay, so we're looking at policies around these areas. And our state policy findings, we hope, will be published in a forthcoming issue of Foreign Language Annals. But what we see is that world language education is very localized to state control and also to local decision makers. So we see a lot of variability. And we see a range of state policy profiles across the US with disparate degrees of offerings and requirements for students. So some states have a lot of requirements about what schools have to do and offer and what students have to do to graduate. Some states have none at all. Okay, so great variability there. But what I do want to highlight today are graduation requirements and what those look like for languages other than English. So we see in 22 states in our study that there were no specific graduation requirements at all related to world language. 8 states have specific world language requirements. So students have to have some degree of credits to graduate in studying a world language. And we see in 21 states, world language is counted at the policy level, at the level of the law, as an elective credit, but it's an option among several. Okay, so it's not the policy in the state isn't specific to world language. So some examples, New Jersey is a state that currently has the highest number of required credits to graduate. It has 5 credits required for graduation. We see in Texas, they're an example of a state we categorize as an elective state, where you need 2 credits in a language other than English, but they count programming as a language. And so that's why we have categorized that as an elective. And so this is pretty common that states will count computer programming or some kind of technical course as fulfilling a language credit. Okay. We also see that some states do have proficiency-based criteria. So students at the high school level can meet graduation requirements through demonstration of proficiency in a world language. I think that's really important for our English learners in particular, who, may need to fulfill these requirements in that way. Okay, so just briefly highlighting these graduation requirements and the further implications for English learners. I wanted to pull a 2021 report by Julie Sugarman at Migration Policy Institute, who talks about, this report is excellent. It looks at graduation requirements and how those impact English learners. So this connection between state policies for graduation and English learner graduation and success. And makes an excellent point that for the sake of equity, college graduation requirements are best if they are aligned as a college preparatory course of study. So they reflect the demands of admissions to four-year universities. Okay, this is what people typically recommend for equity's sake, right? So that when a student graduates, they have that pathway open to them. They're prepared, they're college and career ready through the graduation requirements of the states. Okay, so we see that as a good thing, and personally would promote world language requirements as something that is important for students to have at graduation. And so if that is the case, here in red, I want to highlight that we need to ensure that English learners have access to these pathways, but the supports need to be in place for the strategy to be successful. So I think what this means relative to world language graduation requirements is that we need to ensure that students have ways of demonstrating and meeting those requirements through proficiency, as well as access to instruction so that they can meet those requirements as well. So making sure that there aren't barriers that would keep students from meeting graduation requirements or from being fully sort of this college preparatory level of ready that is implied by the requirements. Okay, so that's the first study that I wanted to highlight briefly related to world language policy. The next thing I want to talk about is the seal of biliteracy. So we saw in the first study that graduation requirements in world languages are pretty rare, but what we do have is the seal of biliteracy in all 50 states. And so if you're not aware, the seal of biliteracy is an award given by a school, district, or county office of education in recognition of students who have studied and obtained proficiency in 2 or more languages by high school graduation. So this is a seal, a credential, a recognition that students receive from their state. As of 2024, all 50 states provide this seal for graduating students. Okay, so this is just a wonderful incentive in the area of world language education, and something that I know those of us in the field were thrilled to see become so widespread. But we know that there's some challenges to implementing the seal that are particular to English learners. So English learners often face additional testing in order to receive the seal. Research has shown that it advantages English proficient students, specifically related to the testing requirement. Languages that have high linguistic capital are often prioritized for resources and for obtaining the seal. There are few assessments of less commonly taught home or heritage languages, so it can be hard to get assessed and demonstrate proficiency in those languages. And there is a focus on biliteracy, reading and writing skills in particular, versus multilingualism. And depending on students' language background and how they've learned or acquired a language, that can be a barrier to them demonstrating their language skills through this seal. Okay, so some real barriers and equity concerns related to multilingual learners. And I just pulled a news source, an online blog about California. That's where the seal started. This is from 2023, that talks about how it's hard for English learners in that state to get the seal of biliteracy because of their state requirements. And so they were trying to address that at the level of state policy. And I know that's the case for many other states. This is a known concern. It's a known issue that states and districts and schools are working on so that multilingual learners can receive the seal and have their language skills acknowledged through this credential. And so in some data from my center, this was a study conducted in 2022 by one of our student researchers, Valerie Garcia. She looked at state requirements and policies to demonstrate English language proficiency. So this is for English learners to obtain the seal. How are they required to demonstrate their English proficiency? And so on the color-coded map here, We see states that have only, like in some states, you have to meet English language arts requirements. In some states, you have to do standardized testing. Maybe that's WIDA access or a different test. In some states, you have to do both English language arts requirements and testing. And then in some states, it's one or the other. And so one of the hard things about doing policy analysis is that it's always changing. So this is a point in time analysis from a couple of years ago. But what I want to emphasize here is that many of these policies do present real barriers to multilingual learners to obtaining the seal. And it's a real equity concern that needs to be addressed. And it's often harder, and the work that English learners or multilingual learners have to do is more, it's a higher standard than their L1 English speaking peers. Okay, so the final study that I'll touch on as I close is a study that's currently in progress on what's called program articulation. We've talked a lot about policy. This is more of a qualitative study that we're conducting. And so the purpose of this study overall is to examine institutional factors and policies that shape program articulation. And what I mean by that is the sequencing and coordination within and across language programs. So that's that graphic I showed where a student is moving from high school into college, right? So if a student is in an elementary school dual language program, how do they transition into middle school? Can they continue to study the language or not? How does a student transition from high school to college? What is that articulation in those pathways? Okay, so the goal of this study is to support high-level proficiency outcomes, and improve enrollments, and expand diversity through better articulation. And we're doing that through focus groups, questionnaires, interviews, and case studies with students, instructors, and administrators in the field of world language, US education. And today, I'm just briefly going to touch on some data from 9 virtual focus groups. That's with 33 participants, representing a wide variety of languages studied in US schools. Okay, and what we see in this study are some emerging strengths. And I want to highlight the one of teachers as advocates for language for all students, because I think this is really encouraging. And in our focus group data, we see more world language teachers who are advocating for English multilingual learners to have their language skills acknowledged, and for those students to also have access to world language education, to enroll in courses, to make sure that courses can support heritage learners adequately. So I was really excited when our teacher focus groups began bringing up multilingual learners and really understanding that world language education should be accessible to them as well. Okay. But we also see a number of barriers coming through our focus group research. The issue that I think is a big one for multilingual learners is a very practical one, and that's of scheduling and course access. If students are receiving English language services, those may be in conflict with other language courses that they would take. They may not have access to those courses because of scheduling constraints. So that's something that we've seen in our data. We also see a lot of information around student advising, and this is something that's emerging as a strong finding for us, that we need to really work with advisors to understand language and multilingualism better, so that they are adequately prepared to help students get credentials, enroll in courses, understand how to develop their language abilities, because they may just not understand what that should look like. And so those are some of the barriers that we're seeing emerge, again, across the US K-12 system. Okay, so that's just a brief sort of snapshot of some of the research that we're doing. But as I come to a close, I want to return to the first question that I had. You know, how can US language education policy and practices support multilingual development for all students? And a couple things that I would say, based on the research that we've done, is that we need to ensure that our policies and requirements are robust and flexible for multilingual learners. So we see language education is for all students. And so what does that look like? Do multilingual learners have pathways? And in many cases, that may involve providing alternative pathways or creative language program offerings that would address some of the scheduling constraints or other practical challenges of serving those students. I think we need have a strong continued focus on equity in graduation requirements, as well as the seal of biliteracy, and push for those issues to be addressed, particularly through funding and resources for proficiency testing and information about those assessments and ways of demonstrating proficiency. As I mentioned, we want to focus on advising and advocacy, that language education is for all students. And also, I think finally, look at communication to multilingual learners and their families. So what are the mechanisms that we have for ensuring that the students and their families are informed about things like the seal of biliteracy and other opportunities so that they understand pathways for developing language skills and can access those? So those are some of my thoughts, but I would love to hear what you all say about this question of the practices and policies that you think would support a more coherent language education in the US. And so with that, I'll open the floor for any comments on that or questions about my talk in general. I'll unshare my screen.